The air was thick with the sterile hum of 100 different systems operating in unison aboard the Galactic Coalition's diplomatic cruiser Aurora's Peace. To most of the species on board, it was a monument to technological sophistication, a place of sterile comfort and diplomatic precision. But to the lone human aboard, a rugged, slightly scarred man named Sergeant Caleb Drayton, it felt more like being stuck in a tin can with the heat turned up. Caleb adjusted his seat at the round table, scanning the room full of representatives. The air was charged, and not in the exhilarating way that came before a fight. It was the tense, stagnant energy of politicians pretending to listen while planning their next move. Caleb, though, wasn't here to argue policy. He was an advisor, specifically brought in by the Coalition to explain human perspectives on combat and warfare, a topic that made everyone in the room uneasy. The gathering wasn't the problem. The problem was the looming disagreement over a crucial topic: deployment protocols for Deathworlder contingents. Caleb, the only Deathworlder in the room, had been silently observing as alien species debated his own existence like a theoretical variable in a physics equation. It was mildly infuriating. "This is preposterous!" barked a towering, fur-covered Zenthari delegate, slamming a massive paw on the table. "The very idea of unleashing humans onto any conflict is barbaric. Their instincts are primal. They act without regard for collective harmony. It is chaos." "Chaos," echoed a smaller, reptilian Drath, nodding in agreement. Its scales glinted under the artificial light. "They escalate rather than de-escalate. And they fight in ways that defy logic." Caleb leaned back, letting their words wash over him. He had learned early on that silence was often the most unsettling thing a human could offer in the face of alien criticism. That and a calm stare. He made sure his gaze swept the room, meeting each pair of eyes, or equivalent sensory organs, with quiet defiance. Finally, the Coalition's lead facilitator, an Avari whose shimmering feathers seemed to shift colors with her emotions, raised a clawed hand. "Please, we are here to discuss the practicality of Deathworlders within tactical frameworks, not engage in character assassination." Caleb cleared his throat. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to command attention. "If you all are done theorizing about what we humans are, maybe you'll let me weigh in." The silence was immediate. He saw the tension ripple through the room, heard a faint intake of breath from a nearby Zenthari guard who seemed to involuntarily stiffen at the sound of his voice. Caleb suppressed a smirk. Fear was an old friend. "As a Deathworlder," Caleb began, "I'm used to people assuming things about us. That we're unpredictable, violent, and overly emotional. But let me tell you something, when push comes to shove, it's not chaos, it's survival. And there's no species better at it than us." The Avari facilitator tilted her head, feathers darkening to a stormy gray. "Survival, you say? Yet survival often comes at a cost, Sergeant Drayton. Can we trust humans to weigh those costs appropriately?" Before Caleb could respond, an alert blared through the room. It was a sharp, grating sound that made even Caleb wince. The Avari facilitator's feathers flared bright red, a universal sign of alarm. "What in the stars?" muttered one of the Zenthari. The table lit up with a holographic projection of the cruiser. Red dots were spreading across the ship's hull like an infection. "Intruders. Security breach," droned the ship's AI. "Multiple boarding parties detected. Species unknown. Hostile intent confirmed." The room descended into chaos. Delegates shouted over one another, some retreating toward the far walls while others frantically communicated with their aides. Caleb rose slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the hologram. The intruders were converging on the command deck. "What do we have on them?" Caleb asked the AI. "Analyzing," it replied, its voice devoid of urgency. "Species designation unknown. Weaponry, advanced plasma-based systems. Objectives unclear." The Avari facilitator turned to Caleb, her feathers a swirling mix of red and white. "Sergeant, you are the closest thing we have to a tactical advisor right now. What do you suggest?" Caleb didn't need to think. "First, lock this room down." Second, get your security teams to contain the breach zones and buy us time to figure out what we're dealing with. And what about you? Asked the draft delegate, his forked tongue flicking nervously. I'm going to do what humans do best, Caleb said, already striding toward the door. He stopped just short of the threshold, turning back with a sly grin. Adapt. The hallways of the Aurora's Peace were eerily quiet, save for the distant echoes of combat. Caleb moved quickly, his every step deliberate. He had insisted on carrying his combat gear aboard, despite the Coalition's initial protests. Now, with his armored suit and kinetic rifle, he felt like himself again, a soldier, not a specimen. He reached the first breach zone just as a squad of Coalition security forces engaged the intruders. The attackers were humanoid but heavily augmented with cybernetic enhancements that made them look like something out of a nightmare. Their movements were unnaturally fast, and their plasma weapons sliced through Coalition defenses like butter. Caleb dropped to one knee, taking aim. His first shot caught an intruder in the chest, sending it sprawling backward with a mechanical screech. The Coalition guards turned to him in surprise, their own weapons proving far less effective. Focus fire on their legs, Caleb barked. They're using cybernetics. Take out their mobility first. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second before obeying. Caleb moved with precision, picking off targets and directing the Coalition forces like a seasoned commander. Within minutes, the immediate threat was neutralized. One of the guards, a nervous-looking Avari, approached him. What are these things? Don't know yet, Caleb admitted, scanning one of the fallen attackers. Its mechanical enhancements were unlike anything he'd seen before, even during Earth's more experimental phases of cybernetic warfare. But they're not here to negotiate. A faint groan drew his attention. One of the attackers was still alive, its cybernetic limbs twitching as it tried to crawl away. Caleb strode over and slammed a boot down on its metallic arm, pinning it to the ground. Talk, he ordered. What's your objective? The attacker hissed, its voice distorted by some kind of vocal modulator. You. Deathworlder not supposed to. Before it could finish, its body convulsed violently. A burst of electricity surged through its systems, and it went limp. Self-destruct protocol. Caleb swore under his breath. These weren't random pirates or mercenaries. This was coordinated. Deliberate. He tapped his comm unit. Command deck, this is Drayton. I need a full diagnostic of the ship's systems. Whoever these guys are, they've planned for this. Understood, Sergeant, came the reply. But we're detecting another breach, closer to engineering. If they disable the core, they won't get the chance, Caleb interrupted. I'm on my way. As he moved, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this attack was more than just a simple boarding raid. The intruders had targeted a Coalition vessel, knowing it would house representatives from dozens of species. It was a bold move, and a dangerous one. But then again, so was underestimating a Deathworlder. Caleb sprinted down the corridor, his boots pounding against the sleek alloy floors of the Aurora's Peace. His rifle was cradled tightly against his chest as he navigated the labyrinthine hallways, adrenaline sharpening his senses to a razor's edge. Every shadow seemed to hold the promise of violence, every turn a potential ambush. He could hear the distant rumble of explosions, the dissonant screeches of alien invaders echoing through the ship like a predator's call. The comm unit in his ear crackled to life. Sergeant Drayton, this is Command Deck. Hostiles have breached engineering. Security teams are engaging, but they're being overwhelmed. We estimate less than 5 minutes before they reach the reactor core. Caleb's jaw tightened. Do we have schematics for their tech? Anything we can exploit? Negative. Their systems are too advanced for immediate analysis. Recommend evacuation protocols for non-combat personnel. Evac's not happening, Caleb growled. If they get their hands on that reactor, this ship becomes a floating bomb. Keep the command deck locked down. I'll handle engineering. The comms fell silent, and Caleb picked up his pace. He wasn't entirely sure how he was going to handle engineering, but uncertainty had never stopped him before. That was the thing about humans. They didn't need to know all the answers. They just needed a problem and the sheer stubbornness to solve it. As he approached the engineering deck, the sound of plasma fire grew louder. Rounding a corner, Caleb skidded to a halt behind a makeshift barricade of overturned cargo crates. A trio of Coalition security guards was pinned down, their faces pale and drenched in sweat as they returned fire in desperate bursts. Across the room, the intruders advanced with unnerving precision, their plasma bolts cutting glowing arcs through the air. "Status?" Caleb barked as he ducked behind the barricade. One of the guards, a burly Zenthari with a deep gash across his shoulder, turned to him. "They're too fast, Sergeant. We can't hold them back." Caleb peered over the edge of the barricade, assessing the situation. The attackers were heavily augmented, their mechanical limbs giving them unnatural agility and strength. But there was something else, something more sinister. Their movements were too synchronized, their tactics too refined. It was as if they were being controlled by a single mind. "Focus fire on their torsos," Caleb ordered. "We're aiming for overloads. Their augments are running hot. Hit the right spot, and they'll short-circuit." The Zenthari nodded grimly, and the guards adjusted their aim. Caleb leaned out of cover, his rifle snapping off precise shots. The first round struck an intruder square in the chest, causing a small explosion as its cybernetic systems overloaded. The creature collapsed in a twitching heap, its limbs sparking. "See?" Caleb said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "They're not invincible. Just ugly." The guards rallied, their renewed confidence evident in their steady fire. One by one, the intruders fell, their advanced tech proving no match for human ingenuity and stubbornness. But Caleb knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The real challenge lay ahead. With the immediate threat neutralized, Caleb turned to the guards. "Stay here and secure the area. I'm going after the ones heading for the core." "You're going alone?" asked the Zenthari, his fur matted with sweat. "Don't worry," Caleb replied with a smirk. "I'm used to being outnumbered." The engineering bay was a cavernous expanse of humming machinery and glowing consoles, its heart dominated by the ship's reactor core. The air was thick with the ozone tang of plasma discharges and the acrid stench of burning metal. Caleb moved silently, his rifle raised as he scanned the shadows for movement. He didn't have to wait long. A squad of intruders was clustered near the reactor, their cybernetic appendages interfacing with the core's control systems. Sparks flew as they worked, their voices a guttural mix of organic and synthetic tones. Caleb couldn't understand their language, but their intent was clear. They were overriding the reactor's fail-safe protocols. Caleb crouched behind a support pillar, assessing his options. Charging in guns blazing was tempting, but it would be suicide. These intruders were faster, stronger, and better equipped. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. His gaze flicked to a nearby maintenance console. A grin spread across his face as an idea took shape. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. All it needed to do was work. Sliding into position, Caleb tapped into the console, his fingers flying across the interface. He had spent enough time on Coalition ships to understand their basic systems, and this one was no different. Within seconds, he had rerouted auxiliary power to the bay's magnetic stabilizers, overloading them. The intruders froze as a deafening hum filled the air. The stabilizers activated, sending powerful electromagnetic pulses rippling through the room. The intruders' cybernetic systems went haywire, their movements jerky and uncoordinated as their augments struggled to compensate. "Gotcha," Caleb muttered, rising from his cover. He opened fire, his shots precise and methodical. The intruders, disoriented and vulnerable, fell one by one. But Caleb's victory was short-lived. One of the attackers, larger and more heavily armored than the others, seemed to shrug off the effects of the stabilizers. Its glowing red eyes locked onto Caleb, and it charged with terrifying speed. Caleb barely had time to react. The intruder's mechanical arms swung toward him, and he dove to the side, narrowly avoiding being crushed. Rolling to his feet, he fired a burst at its torso, but the rounds barely scratched its reinforced plating. "All right, big guy," Caleb muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. Let's dance. The intruder lunged again, its movements a blur. Caleb ducked and weaved, his human reflexes the only thing keeping him alive. He couldn't outmuscle this thing, but he could outthink it. Spotting an exposed conduit on its back, he aimed carefully and fired. The shot hit home, and the intruder convulsed as sparks erupted from its systems. Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby power cable and jammed it into the exposed conduit, sending a surge of electricity through the creature. It let out a distorted roar before collapsing in a smoking heap. Breathing heavily, Caleb surveyed the wreckage. The reactor was still intact, but the intruder's interference had left it unstable. He tapped his comm unit. Engineering secure, but the reactor's been compromised. I'm initiating a manual shutdown. Understood, Sergeant, came the reply. We're dispatching technicians to assist. Caleb sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The immediate danger was over, but his gut told him this was far from finished. These intruders weren't just raiders or pirates. They were organized, methodical, and they had targeted the coalition specifically. As he worked to stabilize the reactor, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever these things were, they had underestimated one crucial detail: humans didn't back down. Not when survival was on the line. And especially not when there was a fight to be won. Caleb barely had a moment to catch his breath before the ship's alarms blared again, louder and more urgent this time. The piercing noise was accompanied by the ship's AI speaking in a tone that, despite its monotone, managed to convey a distinct edge of dread. Alert! Secondary intruder force detected. Hostiles are advancing toward the command deck. Estimated time to breach, 10 minutes. Caleb's stomach tightened. They weren't done yet, not by a long shot. Whoever these attackers were, they had contingency plans in place. His efforts in the engineering bay might have slowed them down, but they were far from finished. The comm unit crackled in his ear. Sergeant Drayton, the situation is deteriorating, said the coalition facilitator, her voice strained. The command deck is under immediate threat. We have no means to repel them. Caleb didn't hesitate. Hold your position. I'm on my way. Be advised, the facilitator continued. We are detecting significantly enhanced hostiles among the new wave. Their energy signatures suggest. I'll deal with it, Caleb interrupted. He didn't have time for a detailed breakdown. If he stopped to analyze every risk, he'd never get anything done. The corridors leading to the command deck were in shambles. Plasma burns scarred the walls, and debris from hastily constructed barricades littered the floor. Caleb passed a group of wounded coalition guards being tended to by medics, their eyes wide with fear. One of them, a young Drath soldier, reached out as Caleb passed. Sergeant, the Drath rasped, his scaled hand trembling. They're not like anything we've faced before. They don't stop. They don't feel. I know, Caleb said, gripping the soldier's hand briefly. But neither do I, when it comes to protecting my people. The Drath's expression flickered with something resembling hope, and Caleb moved on. As he approached the command deck, the sounds of battle grew louder. The clash of plasma fire and the guttural growls of the attackers echoed down the halls. Caleb ducked into a side room and activated his rifle's diagnostics. He was running low on ammunition, and his armor's energy reserves were nearly depleted. He didn't need stats to know the odds weren't in his favor. But odds had never stopped him before. The scene at the command deck was chaos incarnate. Coalition guards were falling back under the relentless assault of the intruders, whose augmented forms glinted menacingly in the flickering emergency lights. Among them were larger, more heavily armored variants that moved like tanks on legs, shrugging off most of the guards' firepower. Caleb scanned the room quickly, identifying the weak points in the attackers' formation. The heavily armored ones were slow but devastating, their plasma cannons tearing through the coalition's defenses. The smaller ones were faster, their cybernetic limbs allowing them to climb walls and flank their targets. Form up! Caleb shouted as he joined the fray, his voice cutting through the chaos. Focus fire on the big one's joints, knees and elbows. Bring them down to our level. I'll handle the rest. The guards hesitated for a moment, then snapped into action. Caleb's calm, commanding presence seemed to inject them with a renewed sense of purpose. Plasma bolts began targeting the weak points in the armored intruders, slowing their advance. Caleb darted toward the nearest enemy, a smaller intruder scaling the wall. He fired a burst, catching it in the torso. Sparks erupted as the creature fell to the ground, thrashing before going still. He pivoted, narrowly avoiding a plasma shot from another attacker, and returned fire with precision. The coalition guards, emboldened by his leadership, were holding their ground. But Caleb could see it wouldn't last. The attackers were adapting, their movements becoming more coordinated. They were learning. One of the massive intruders lumbered toward Caleb, its plasma cannon charging. He dove behind a fallen barricade as the blast tore through the air, obliterating everything in its path. Rolling to his feet, he grabbed a nearby thermal grenade from a fallen soldier's belt and hurled it at the intruder. The grenade detonated with a fiery roar, engulfing the attacker in flames. Its armor glowed red-hot as it stumbled, mechanical joints seizing up from the heat. Caleb seized the opportunity, emptying the remainder of his rifle's magazine into the exposed conduits on its back. The intruder collapsed in a smoking heap. "Nice try," Caleb muttered, reloading his weapon. Despite their efforts, the attackers continued to press forward. Caleb's comm unit buzzed with an incoming transmission from the command deck. "Sergeant, the intruders have breached our secondary defenses. We can't hold them much longer." Caleb's mind raced. They were running out of time, and the coalition guards were running out of strength. He needed to end this, now. Then he saw it, the intruder's control node. It was a small, spherical device carried by one of the armored attackers, its surface glowing with pulsating light. Caleb didn't know exactly what it did, but he had a hunch it was coordinating the intruder's movements. He tapped into the comm channel. "Everyone, focus on the big one carrying the glowing ball. That's their brain. We take it out, we take them all out." The coalition guards redirected their fire, but the intruder with the control node was heavily shielded, and its plasma cannon was wreaking havoc. Caleb gritted his teeth. There was only one way to do this. "I need cover fire!" he shouted. Without waiting for a response, he sprinted toward the intruder, weaving through plasma fire with practiced agility. Every step brought him closer, the glow of the control node growing brighter. The armored intruder turned its cannon toward him, but Caleb was faster. He leaped onto its back, using a jagged piece of debris as a foothold. The creature thrashed, trying to shake him off, but Caleb held on, driving his combat knife into the exposed conduits at its joints. Sparks flew as the intruder staggered, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. Caleb climbed higher, gripping the control node. It was pulsing with energy, sending surges of electricity through his armor. Gritting his teeth, he yanked it free with a guttural roar. The effect was immediate. The remaining intruders froze, their movements halting as if someone had flipped a switch. Caleb tumbled to the ground, clutching the control node. Around him, the coalition guards stared in stunned silence as the attackers collapsed. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's systems. Caleb stood slowly, his muscles screaming in protest. He held the control node aloft, his expression grim. "This," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "is why you don't mess with a Deathworlder." The guards erupted in cheers, their fear replaced by something far more powerful: hope. But Caleb wasn't smiling. He could feel the heat radiating from the node, its power still humming beneath the surface. This wasn't over. Not yet. The silence after the battle was as oppressive as the chaos that had preceded it. The command deck was strewn with the remains of intruders and broken barricades, the air thick with the acrid tang of melted metal and scorched electronics. Caleb stood at the center of it all, the glowing control node still clutched in his hand. Its faint pulses of light and heat were a reminder that whatever coordinated this attack was still active, somewhere. He looked around, meeting the eyes of the coalition guards who had fought beside him. They were battered, bloody, and exhausted, but alive. The weight of what had just transpired pressed heavily on their shoulders, and the uncertainty of what would come next hung unspoken in the air. "Sergeant Drayton," came the voice of the Coalition facilitator through his comm unit. Her voice, usually calm and measured, was now tinged with urgency. "You've bought us time, but our systems have detected a signal emanating from that device. It's transmitting coordinates." Caleb's grip tightened on the node. "Coordinates to what?" "We don't know," the facilitator replied. "But if this is their command system, it's likely calling for reinforcements. We estimate less than 20 minutes before they arrive." A cold realization settled over Caleb. This wasn't the end of the fight, it was only the prelude to something much worse. "Patch me through to engineering," he said. A moment later, the chief engineer's voice came through the comm. "Sergeant Drayton, we've stabilized the reactor thanks to your work earlier." "What do you need?" "I need to know if we can use the reactor to generate a short-range EMP burst," Caleb said. "Something strong enough to fry this node and anything it's connected to." The engineer hesitated. "It's possible, but risky. Overloading the reactor like that could destabilize it again. If we failed to bring it back under control, we'd lose the ship." Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. "If reinforcements get here, we're losing the ship anyway." There was a brief silence before the engineer replied. "Understood. I'll get started on the overload sequence. But you'll need to bring the node to the reactor core for maximum effect." "I'll be there," Caleb said, ending the transmission. He turned to the Coalition guards. "I need a team to secure the reactor. The rest of you, fortify this deck. If those reinforcements show up before we're done, they'll head straight for command." The guards exchanged weary glances, but there was no hesitation as they moved to carry out his orders. Caleb couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. For all their differences, the Coalition had shown that they could rally when it mattered most. The journey to the engineering deck was tense, every corner and shadow a potential threat. Caleb moved quickly, flanked by a small group of guards. The control node continued to pulse in his hand, as if taunting him with the knowledge that time was slipping away. When they reached the reactor room, the chief engineer was waiting for them, his multiple limbs moving frantically over the control panels. The reactor core loomed at the center of the room, its containment field humming with barely contained energy. "We've prepped the system for the EMP burst," the engineer said, glancing at Caleb. "Place the node on that platform." He pointed to a circular pad near the base of the core, lined with intricate conduits and glowing interfaces. Caleb approached the platform and set the node down. It pulsed more intensely now, as if aware of what was about to happen. "Once we activate the sequence, the burst will fry the node," the engineer explained. "But it'll also knock out most of our secondary systems. We'll be flying blind for a few minutes." Caleb nodded. "Do it." The engineer hesitated for a moment, then began typing commands into the console. The reactor's hum grew louder, the containment field crackling with energy as the overload sequence began. The first sign of reinforcements came sooner than anyone had expected. The ship's sensors, still operational for the moment, detected multiple vessels dropping out of hyperspace near the Aurora's piece. The facilitator's voice came through the comm, panic barely concealed. "Sergeant Drayton, enemy ships have arrived. They're launching boarding craft. Estimated impact in 3 minutes." "Understood," Caleb replied grimly. He turned to the guards in the room. "Hold this position. If they breach, buy us as much time as you can." The guards saluted, their expressions resolute despite the odds. Caleb returned his attention to the engineer, whose hands were a blur over the controls. "How long until the burst is ready?" Caleb demanded. 2 minutes, the engineer replied. "But—" The door to the reactor room exploded inward, cutting him off. A new wave of intruders stormed in, their forms even more advanced and menacing than before. These weren't just foot soldiers, they were designed for this. "Hold the line!" Caleb roared, raising his rifle. The room erupted into chaos. Plasma bolts lit the air, and the guards fought valiantly, their weapons chipping away at the intruders' augmented forms. Caleb moved like a force of nature, his shots precise and devastating. But the attackers were relentless, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm them. One of the intruders broke through the line, charging straight for the platform where the nodes sat. Caleb intercepted it, tackling the creature to the ground. They grappled, its mechanical limbs thrashing as it tried to throw him off. Caleb drove his knife into a joint, severing critical connections, and the intruder collapsed in a twitching heap. The engineer shouted over the din. "The EMP is ready! Initiating now!" Caleb scrambled to his feet, grabbing hold of a nearby console as the reactor's energy reached its peak. The room was bathed in blinding light as the EMP burst erupted from the core, a wave of electromagnetic energy rippling outward. The intruders froze mid-attack, their systems fried. One by one, they collapsed lifeless. The control node on the platform let out a final pulse before shattering into pieces. The aftermath was a surreal mix of relief and exhaustion. The EMP had done its job, disabling the reinforcements and saving the ship, for now. But the cost was high. The Aurora's piece was crippled, its systems barely operational, and the surviving crew was battered and weary. Caleb stood in the reactor room, staring at the shattered remains of the control node. He felt a deep weariness settle over him, but also a grim satisfaction. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. The Coalition facilitator's voice came through the comm, softer now. "Sergeant Drayton, you've saved us. The Council owes you a great debt." Caleb exhaled slowly. "This wasn't just about saving the ship. Whoever sent those things, they'll try again. We need to be ready." "We will be," the facilitator said. "With your help." Caleb glanced at the exhausted guards around him, their faces a mix of pride and relief. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a small smile. "Good," he said. "Because this is just the beginning." And with that, Caleb turned and walked away, ready to face whatever came next.